So I'm gonna introduce Drew Hailpern. I don't know if I pronounced the name right with my accent. I met Drew at one of the conferences I've been to, and he is the single most knowledgeable person I know about the college admission tests. That's why we invited him, and you're about to see why. So.
Lenny, Darby, thanks so much for the invitation to present. Also, thanks to the Brookline PTO for the invitation. Before we get into it, just a couple of goals for tonight. One, I'm going to do everything in my power to try to convince you that at the end of the day, this is just a test. You'll hear me say this throughout the talk, but really, for students in the room and for parents in the room, students, your standardized testing scores do not dictate your life, your future happiness, and how everything is going to go for you. You are not going to be living in a van down by a river according to what your SAT or ACT scores are. So anything we can do, just to build on what Darby and Lenny already referred to, anything we can do to just try to ratchet down the pressure, keep this in perspective, realize it's just a test. It doesn't measure your creativity. It doesn't measure your grit. It doesn't measure future success. It really, at the end of the day, it is just a test. So that's goal one. Goal two, again, just want to talk a little bit about testing planning and what that means and what goes into that. Also want to put these tests in context for you so you have a better understanding of how college admissions officers are using them. And then the bulk of this talk is going to be going through the differences between the SAT and ACT. So for parents in the room, it's not that same SAT that we all knew and love, and that ACT, more and more students are taking that ACT, and depending on where you grew up, you might not have any familiarity with that ACT. So just want to debunk that ACT and make you more familiar with it. Then depending on time, also just want to talk about subject tests just real briefly. We'll end with a little bit on score choice and super scoring, just especially for those of you who are first time through this process, just so you understand what those terms are. And just in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask that we try to hold questions to the end. As Lenny kind of referred to, I can talk about this all night, literally all night. But I don't want to do that. I want to make sure we get out of here at a reasonable hour. And also just special thanks to the students for coming out tonight. I know there's probably a million other places you would rather be than right here, listening to me talk about standardized testing. So thank you for coming out. Okay, other quick logistical things before we dive into this. I think everyone got a copy of this. There is a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. So if you want to take notes or follow along or know your presentation future, please consult the PowerPoint. Also, we do offer free proctored practice tests every weekend in our Newton office. So please don't hesitate to take advantage of those. There's no obligation to that. You just need to call us and register for it. Particularly for the juniors, you're getting your PSAT scores back. If you want to try out an ACT, but under a more low pressure type of way in a diagnostic setting, give us a call, because again, we offer them every Saturday and Sunday, so please take advantage of that. And then lastly, before we dive into this, I am going to throw a lot of information at you in a relatively short amount of time. Don't feel like you have to hang on my every word. Obviously, I'll feel flattered if you do, but really the point of this is just for you to get some big picture take-home messages, just kind of the gestalt of sort of the standardized testing landscape. And then lastly, everything that I'm going to cover tonight is in that testing guide. So again, don't worry if you miss something. You can go back into that book back to various points that you want to review. And also, don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions or anything. We love talking to students and talking to families and helping them, try to guide them through it. And then just before we dive in, just by a quick show of hands, how many of you, this is your first time through the college admissions process with a son or daughter? And students, obviously, you can put your hands up. Okay, most of you. How many of you have gone through this before? Okay, so you're slightly outnumbered here. So there is one homework assignment coming out of this. So again, one more time, for those of you first time through, raise your hand. One of the traits that you'll need in this process is a little bit of courage, so you got to keep your hand up as I'm talking. So first time through, keep them up. And then the one homework assignment coming out of this, for those of you who have gone through this before, you have to find someone with their hand up and reassure them that everything is going to be fine, because everything will be fine. All right, and with that, let me dive in. So I start with this slide. This is probably the #1 question that I get at this presentation, which goes something like this. Drew, we're in a pretty competitive college landscape environment. Can my son or daughter applying from the Northeast really get into his or her top schools? Top school or top schools by just submitting an ACT score. And for those of you who are totally new to this, the two major tests that colleges are looking for are the SAT and the ACT. And the answer to that question, students absolutely can. Colleges do not care if you apply with an SAT or an ACT score. And you can see, nationally speaking, actually more students take the ACT than take the SAT. And there's enough parents and guardians in the room, I might actually get a few hands up on this. Did any of you take the ACT as your college admission test? All right, like 6 of you. Okay, now I get to play. Put your hands up one more time. Now I get to play, are any of you from Illinois, Michigan, or Ohio? Okay, I've pretty much hit everybody. Okay, I'm not psychic. They weren't plants. The reason why I guessed those 3 states is just historically speaking, the ACT always been more of a Midwest test, whereas the SAT more of an East Coast, West Coast test. But that landscape is totally changing. More and more of our students here in the Northeast are taking the ACT, and more students from the Midwest are taking the SAT. And again, colleges do not care whether you submit an SAT or an ACT score. They're accepted equally. And again, just trying to come back to that theme of it really is just a test. Trying to put this in context for you in terms of how colleges use it. What you're looking at is this is a survey done by NACAC. NACAC's the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, and they reached out to college admissions officers and they said, okay, can you give us a feel, just in terms of these various components, how you rank them in their importance? And the #1 most important thing that colleges come back with, the most important thing that they consider is a student's GPA and day in and day out performance. The next thing that they consider is that rigor of that curriculum. Did students take advantage of the opportunities presented to them? And then depending on how you do the math, it's either the 3rd or 4th most important thing, that admission test scores. And again, as Lenny already alluded to, and we'll come back to this, more and more schools are going test optional. So for many schools, they're not even considering or looking at those scores at all. But even those colleges that are getting 30,000 plus applications, they are reading the essays from every applicant, they are reading the counselor recommendations, they are reading the teacher recommendations, they're looking at the students' extracurricular activities and position of leadership. And all of that is what's going into that final admissions decision. And this is a term you'll hear often. It's called a holistic review. With that holistic review, what admissions officers are trying to do is they're trying to get to know the student as a student and as a person, not just as a number. So they're not taking the GPA, standardized testing scores, putting it in some kind of algorithm or formula, and making an admissions decision based on that number. All of these factors are what's considered. And you can see, I'll just mention this briefly, in terms of class rank here. Brookline High School doesn't rank their students, so obviously it's not going to hurt your students in this process that there isn't a class rank. And more high schools are actually moving away from that class rank. And I know Lenny mentioned this, but I do just want to mention it one more time. More and more schools are going test optional. More and more competitive schools are going test optional. It's not just more rural schools or schools we've never heard of. Schools that are increasingly appearing on our students' lists include Holy Cross, test optional school, Wake Forest, another school that's increasingly appearing on our kids' list, test optional schools. And when you talk to admissions officers who are at test optional schools, what they'll tell you is something along these lines is, Drew, there's a certain population of students where those standardized testing scores just aren't reflective of what that student's capable of. And for that population of students, I'd rather not see those scores. I can get everything I need to know about that student's abilities and how well I think that student's going to fit into our culture here at our college by looking at all those other factors we discussed in that previous slide. The other nice thing about the test optional movement is a number of schools now have been test optional for a number of years. And again, when you talk to them, they have really nice data that shows that the classes that they've admitted since they've gone test optional are just as strong, if not stronger, than the classes they admitted when they considered standardized testing scores. The one caveat to the test optional schools, just so you're aware of, For some of the schools that admit test optionally, when they give merit aid awards, so generally that's non-need based financial aid awards, sometimes those schools consider standardized tests in making those awards. And I can't stress this enough either. Colleges are not playing gotcha here. They're very open about their policies. So if you're applying to a test optional school that gives merit aid money and you're interested in being considered for that money, you can always just call them and ask, do they consider standardized testing scores when making those awards? And then the other thing in terms of the test optional movement, and again, back to the colleges not playing gotcha, they're not going to look at a Brookline High School student and say, okay, looks great on paper. They didn't send standardized testing scores, so obviously they're terrible, so we're not going to admit that student. That's not the way, that's not the game that they're playing. They're really trying to be supportive in the way that they review these applications and put that student's scores and that student's profile in the best light. So then the question I always get is, all right, Drew, so it's 2017. Why am I up here tonight talking about standardized testing? Why are all of you here tonight hearing me talk about standardized testing? Why are we looking at this sort of infamous bell curve? There's a couple pressures at play that unfortunately don't seem like they're going away anytime soon that are preserving standardized testing. One is just more and more international students are applying to our US colleges and university, trying to get into our college education system. So admissions officers are just increasingly faced with applicants from schools that they have no history with that applicant. So they've never admitted anyone from that school, or they might not have even seen an application from anyone at that school. And thus, even for those students, the standardized testing is just a data point, it's just a piece of data, but it does help them put in context some of the other metrics that they're looking, so that student's transcript, GPA, again, just another data point. And even for those students, this is not the be-all, end-all for those students, but again, it's just, it helps them just with a little bit of context in terms of what they're seeing. And this is when coming from Brookline High School is just, for lack of a better word, a nice advantage. Just all colleges in the country know the caliber of the Brooklyn High curriculum, know the caliber of our students, just know how rigorous that curriculum is and know how ready they are for that college experience. Not to say that the standardized testing scores aren't going to be looked at for those schools that consider it, but again, it's not going to be the be-all, end-all of that application. And then again, I'm going to hit you with a relatively, with a large amount of material in a short amount of time, but if you only remember one slide, this is the slide I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these standardized tests often comes down to having a testing plan. And the testing plan is just answering 3 basic questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And if you're going to do some prep for it, how and when should I prepare for them? And the reason why having a plan is helpful, it helps to take away some of the anxiety around this process, knowing that you have a plan, knowing when you're going to take those tests. And the other thing is too, it just makes sure that those students aren't going in and taking these tests cold. Keep in mind, these are national tests. The vast majority of students nationally still walk in on a random Saturday morning and are like, oh, it's an SAT day today. They go in, they take the test. They're like, that was horrible, but at least I'm done. And then they kind of let the chips fall where they fall. But if you can answer these 3 questions, which test should I take, when should I take them, and how and when should I prepare for them, it just, again, alleviates some of the anxiety. It just enables you to put your best foot forward on these tests. The one thing on this testing plan, and Lenny already alluded to this, there's no right or wrong way to do this. At the end of the day, that best testing plan is going to be what works best for you as a family and what works best for your students. And you'll hear me say this throughout the talk, but I encourage you to please do everything you can to kind of drown out the noise on this. Unfortunately, we're in an environment now where the pressures are all about early and often testing. Just keep testing, testing, testing. Keep starting earlier and earlier and earlier. But statistically speaking, students hit their best scores in late spring of junior year, fall of senior year, because performance on these tests does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So if you're talking to neighbors or friends or cousins, and they're telling you like, yeah, we've been prepping for this since 8th grade, we've already taken the test 5 times, I just encourage you, just smile sweetly and say, that's fantastic. We might be going a slightly different direction than that. So anything you can do to kind of not get hung up or get caught up in this early and often testing, try to stay in your, we call it, try to stay in your own lane. Try to be as self-centered as you can on this. Just think about what's going to be best for you and not worry if that plan is different than what a neighbor is doing, a best friend is doing, or even, you know, possibly an older sibling is doing. And then when we're talking about the tests, these are the tests in that standardized testing landscape. So PSAT really is just for practice. I know scores just came back, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on that, just so you have a better understanding of what that score is. SAT, ACT is going to be the bulk of the presentation tonight. Subject tests, I'm just going to talk on real briefly. It's only the most competitive schools that are still looking at subject tests. For parents and guardians in the room, we knew them as achievement tests or SAT 2s, and then AP tests just outside of the scope of what we have time to cover tonight. So I'm going to start with that PSAT. That P means preliminary. We think of it as practice. Colleges do not see these scores. They do not make any admissions decisions based on these scores. Really, the benefit of that PSAT comes from that practice. Anytime students get an opportunity to take a practice test under real conditions, it's always good practice. And again, for students and parents, I know Lenny already referred to this, but please don't get hung up on that top line score. The College Board recognizes that students are taking this early, so for juniors, taking it in October of junior year, it's a little bit early. Again, most students hit that best score late spring of junior year, fall of senior year. And where you start on that PSAT and where you end up finishing on either an SAT or ACT is often two very, very different places. So if you get that PSAT score and it comes back a little bit lower than what you were hoping for, please don't hit the panic button. It doesn't, colleges aren't going to see it. You have tons of time in terms of being able to boost that score to make it a little bit more reflective of who you feel you are as a student. Really, the benefit of that PSAT comes from getting that test booklet, getting that itemized score report, and you'll see every question you got right and every question you got wrong. And that's what I'm encouraging students to do. Have the discipline, go back in, look at those questions that you missed, identify your areas of strengths, identify your areas of weaknesses, and that's what the benefit of that PSAT is. Not that top line score or how well you did compared to how well your friends did. Just real quickly, I do just want to go over the scoring of it. That SAT, it's on that 200 to 800 point scale that we all kind of know and love. That PSAT, you'll notice it's on a 160 to 760 scale. So the question I always get is, all right, Drew, it's at a 760 instead of 800. So when I get my PSAT scores, and I get my verbal score, and I get my math score, can I just add 40 points to that score, and that would be the score that I would get on the SAT? And the answer to that is, unfortunately, no. You can't do that. So I won't get into it, but you can kind of see the way this slide is arranged. All these tests are what they call vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means, if you got a 650 on the verbal on that PSAT and you got a 650 on the math, that is the score you would have gotten had you taken the SAT on that day. So you can think of it as a baseline score. You can think of it as a proxy for an SAT score, but again, don't get hung up on that score itself. And the reason why it gets cut off at 760, the College Board recognizes that students are taking this a little bit early. So for instance, on that math section, those hardest math questions in that 760 to 800 point range just aren't on that PSAT. So that's why the curve ends at 760. Similarly, there's some easier questions on the PSAT that just aren't on the SAT in that 160 to 200 point range. So that's why that entire curve is shifted left. So hopefully this helps as you're looking at that PSAT score in terms of interpreting kind of what it means. And then just at a high level, just in terms of framing the rest of the talk, especially in terms of those differences between the SAT and ACT, just want to look at it at a high level. So this is kind of the 30,000 foot view. Anytime test takers or test writers create a test, there's two components that go into the design of that test. The first is aptitude versus curriculum. Aptitude in its purest form, we think of that as an IQ test, measuring a student's, quote, innate ability to learn. Curriculum-based test, exactly as it sounds, more in line with what students are doing day in and day out in school. The other component that goes into the design of standardized tests is speed versus power. Power speaks to the trickiness of the questions on that test, the misdirection that's on that test, the complexity of the reading on that test, whereas speed, exactly as it sounds, that's the difficulty of the test stems from the speededness of it. Can students actually get through the test in the time allotted? And not to bring back vicious flashbacks for all the parents and guardians in the room of your own standardized testing experience, but some of you might remember that old, what I'm calling that old PSAT and old SAT, tons of misdirection on that test. A lot of trying to make things seem much harder than they actually were. A lot of, when I was working with students on that old PSAT or old SAT, a lot of trying to help students get inside the test taker's head and really understand what that question's asking. And when they were 50-50 on it, really understand what makes a right answer right and a wrong answer wrong. College Board understandably started facing some pretty severe criticism for having a test like that felt random to kids, felt esoteric, felt disconnected from what they were doing in school day in and day out. So one of the goals of that redesigned SAT, which went into effect in spring 2016, was to make it more of a curriculum-based test. More in line with what students are doing day in and day out, more accessible to students. The ACT was formed in the 1950s. It was formed to be in direct competition with the SAT. And because the SAT, much more of an aptitude power test, to compete against that, the ACT intentionally designed it to be the polar opposite. So by design, that ACT, much more of a speed test, much more of a curriculum-based test. So the ACT, it's had a reputation of being, quote, the easier test. And the reason for that is just because of its history. It's always been more of a curriculum-based test, more in line with what students were doing day in and day out. But it doesn't mean it's an easier test. The difficulty of that ACT comes from the speed of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. So often a student who takes an ACT for the first time will walk out of there and be like, Drew, I didn't think it was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it. But that's where the difficulty on that ACT comes from. They don't actually have that 5 or 10 minutes that they feel they need. And then that redesigned SAT, again, more curriculum-based test, a little bit less of an aptitude test. It's still the College Board. It still has what I call SAT-ness to it. It still has an element of misdirection and trickiness to it, but not to the extent of that old SAT and old PSAT that we all kind of knew and loved. And as we do a side-by-side comparison of the two tests, you'll get a feel in terms of how this power versus speed plays out on this test. So here they are. Here's the SAT and the ACT. First thing to notice, they're both long. 3 hours and 15 minutes on that SAT if students take that optional essay, 3 hours, 35 minutes on that ACT if students write that optional ACT essay. And when I put this slide up, a lot of times students will immediately just kind of look at me and be like, Drew, I know exactly which test I'm taking. I don't need to hear another word of this presentation. I'm going ACT. And what they're focusing on is this. They see that 65-minute reading section on that SAT, and then they see that 35-minute reading section on the ACT, and they're like, this is the easiest decision ever. I'm going ACT. But that 35-minute reading section, it comes with a little bit of a catch. So that 35-minute reading section, it's 4 passages, it's 40 questions, which breaks down to about 8.5 minutes per passage, and students have 8.5 minutes to read and understand a pretty lengthy passage, and then answer 10 questions on that passage, which further breaks down to about 4 to 4.5 minutes to read and understand it. And you can't just skim it, you have to read it for understanding, and then 4 to 4.5 minutes to answer 10 questions. And you gotta keep that up for that full 35 minutes. Not an easy thing, a total sprint from start to finish. Whereas on that SAT reading, the difficulty comes from partly it's just focus. It's 65 minutes, it's reading passage after reading passage after reading passage after reading passage after reading passage. Not an easy thing to be able to maintain that kind of level of focus and attention to detail in that 65-minute section. That writing and language and English sections, these are the two sections that are probably most similar to one another. This is the grammar portions of the test where students are given passages with various grammatical errors, and they're asked to correct those errors as they go through it. I'm going to date myself with this reference, but this is back to Strunk and White's Element of Style, for those of us familiar with that book, and Warner's Book of Composition, for those of us who learned grammar through that 700-page book monstrosity, which then brings us to the math. You'll see on that SAT, same as on that PSAT, there's a no calculator math section. Students, they're not taking your calculator away to torment you or to cause you undue anxiety. The reason why they're taking away your calculator is they're trying to test your math fluency. Do you actually understand the math behind the math? Not just, can you grab a calculator, put in numbers, find an answer, and really have no idea what you're finding, but rather, do you actually understand what slope of the line is? And do you understand what you're finding when you find slope of the line? So that's the idea of that no calculator section, a way to test math fluency. And then there's a math calculator section 55 minutes after. ACT, again, a little bit more user-friendly for students, but the calculator's allowed throughout, but the difficulty stems from the speed of it. 60 minutes, 60 questions, it's about 1 minute per question. Again, total sprint from start to finish. Reading, we've already discussed. And then on that ACT, if you're not familiar with it, you'll see it has a separate science section. It's not really science. They're not going to ask you what the chemical formula of photosynthesis is. It's more deductive reasoning and logic. Can students work their way through a scientific passage of which they might not know anything about, interpret the tables and the figures and the graphs, and as they work through it, get a better understanding of what that passage was about? On the SAT, they're trying to embed science throughout. It's a little bit forced on the SAT. According to the College Board, a student's demonstrating their understanding of science if they can interpret a table or a graph. I might argue there might be a little bit more involved to science than just being able to read a table or a figure. But the way this plays out on the SAT is, even though we're in the reading section or a grammar portion, there's going to be a table or a figure, and students are going to be asked to interpret what that table or figure means, and by doing so, show their mastery of science. Which then brings me to the essay. You'll see it's optional. It's a total standalone score. Just as a hedge for us, we always recommend that when students take the SAT or the ACT at least once, that they try it with the essay. And the reason for that is it's something like less than 13% of colleges that require the SAT essay. More colleges require that ACT essay. But again, back to it being just a hedge, we just don't want seniors, fall of senior year, suddenly at a school and realize that that school requires the essay, and they haven't taken these tests with the essay, and now possibly they're scrambling to take this test one more time. So colleges aren't putting any weight on this essay score. They're not looking at this essay score, but there are colleges out there that require it. So again, just as a hedge, we recommend that students try these tests with the essay. And then what we'll do now is we'll just go over some sample questions. I won't call on anyone to actually answer these, but just so you get a better idea in terms of how this power versus speed plays out between these two tests. So we'll start with the writing and language and the English. These are the two sections that are most similar to one another. Again, this is the grammar portion of it. Again, because the SAT has more of a power component to it, a little bit harder reading on those SAT passages. Diction, a little bit tougher. And ACT, a little bit easier reading passages, more in line, more of a peer editing assignment for students, more in line with sort of what a typical high school student might write. And then again, that inclusion of data graphics, that's that SAT trying to incorporate science throughout their test. So here's what it looks like on the ACT. Again, we won't go through it. Number 8 here is just testing verb tense. Number 9 is testing punctuation. Do students understand the correct use of a colon or a semicolon? Here's what it looks like on the SAT, almost identical. If you had a chance, I know I flipped through it quickly, but if you have had the chance to kind of read this passage, you can see reading a little bit simpler, a little bit less dense than what's on that SAT. And again, here's the data graphic, SAT testing science. And again, more of a power test, a little bit more nuanced on that SAT. Not only are students going to be asked to interpret this table, but also to figure out why the author is including this table. How does this table support the central argument that they're trying to make? Which then brings us to the reading. All you really need to know about the differences in the reading is that timing. On that SAT, It's 65 minutes, it's 5 passages, it's 13 minutes a passage. Whereas on that ACT, 35 minutes, 4 passages, about 8.5 to 8 3/4 minutes per passage. In the world of standardized testing, just a huge difference between having 13 minutes a passage and 8 3/4 minutes on a passage. So by just knowing that timing, you can pretty much guess in terms of the type of questions that SAT versus ACT is going to ask. So that SAT, much more nuanced reading, much more analytical reading, much more of a line-by-line type of reading. And again, the complexity of the reading on that SAT just further than what's on the ACT. So there's going to be a fiction passage, which is generally an excerpt from a 19th century British novel. There's also more primary source material on that SAT, so speech by Alexander Hamilton or Jefferson. Whereas on the ACT, just those reading passages a little bit simpler, and again, requiring less of a detailed, nuanced reading of it, more in that limited amount of time, were students able to read and understand it and get that basic understanding, that basic gist or the central argument that that author was trying to make. So we won't actually, in the interest of time, I won't throw passages up, but just to give you a feel for the types of questions. SAT, more of the questions along these lines, what can reasonably be inferred? And then there'll be a follow-up question, which choice provides the best evidence? So students are gonna have to go in and do a line-by-line analysis and actually find the lines in the passage that helps them defend this answer here. Whereas on the ACT, they just don't have time for that. More of the questions along these lines, the passage points to this. In that short amount of time, were students able to read, understand it, and find that central argument that author was trying to make. Which then brings us to everyone's favorite topic, the math. SAT, much narrower and deeper focus on the math. 60 to 70% of the math on that SAT is Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. Obviously, if they emphasize something, they need to de-emphasize something. What got de-emphasized was geometry. So geometry is less than 10% of the math that's on that SAT. Not a random decision that the College Board made. They didn't just decide, hey, let's make 70% of our SAT math algebra. This came from studies they did where they reached out to colleges and they asked, okay, for your students who are doing well in intro math courses or going on to do more advanced math courses or major in math, what background did they have? And they came back with, our students had a solid foundation in algebra. So that's what's driving that. Again, that no calculator section, testing a student's math fluency. Do they understand the math behind the math? And again, more of a power test on that SAT, more time per question on that ACT. ACT, broader and shallower, only 30% is algebra, way more topics covered on that ACT. Calculators allowed throughout, which is always nice, but again, the difficulty stems from the speed of it. Just an incredibly fast-paced test. 60 seconds per question, 60 minutes, 60 questions. Here's the way power versus speed plays out, for instance, on a slope of the line question. And I'll just read this just so you can hear it. And again, I won't call on anybody here. But on the SAT, it reads something like this. The graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a0 and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? And most students have the same reaction, which we have, especially when I read it like that, which is, what? I have no idea what that is asking me. It's actually not that bad a question. The way they could have worded this question, which would have been way more accessible to students, is they could have said, the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0 and 0, 2. What is the slope of that line? And for most students, they'd be like, oh, they're asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. It's not that bad. But again, this is where the misdirection comes in. This is where the trickiness comes in. For students to really figure out that all this is asking is the slope of the line between 2 points, they have to work their way through this whole thing of if a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b. Whereas on the ACT, just less interested in playing that game. Much more of a straightforward question. Slope of one of the lines is 3. They're asking for the slope of the perpendicular line, and this one I'll throw out there. I know there's students in the room. It's your chance to be on local cable access. Anyone want to be brave and shout out the answer to this? -1/3, very good. We'll give you a round of applause for that, well done. And sometimes families, when students yell it out the answer before you're even done finishing the question, they're like, oh my gosh, my child is a super genius. I had no idea. It's designed it's designed to be instantly recognized. You either know it or you don't. So you either remember that that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes, or you don't. If you do remember that, the answer choice here is C, negative 1/3. If you don't remember that, there's no way to logic your way to the answer. There's nothing to figure out. You either know it or you don't. Again, the difference between power versus speed. Which then brings me to the science section. Again, we already talked about this on the SAT. A little bit forced, 21 science-related questions embedded throughout. On the ACT, again, not measuring your scientific knowledge per se, more your deductive reasoning and logic. Can you work your way through a passage of which you might not know anything about, using the scientific method to guide you, to try to be able to interpret those figures and graphs and come to some kind of understanding of what's being asked. Here's what it looks like on the ACT. And it's designed to take students' breaths away a little bit the first time they see it. Oftentimes students will flip through an ACT science section and be like, Drew, 35 minutes for this? There's no possible way I'm gonna get through this. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I don't need to know any of that in order to be able to answer this question. What I do need to be able to do is obviously read the question according to figure 1. I have to find figure 1. Obviously it has to be this, because it's the only thing on the slide. The temperature of the outer core, well, I know the outer core is here, and I know its temperature, and I know how to read a graph, so I know I'm on the y-axis here, is approximately between, I know I'm between these two dashed lines here, I know I'm between these 2 points here, so I know that answer choice is C, 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I found. I have no idea what that actually means, but I know that's the answer. And this is where the ACT is tough for students. It has the tendency to turn on everybody's OCD, even when you don't have OCD. And the reason for that is because students are working at a pace that's generally faster than what they're comfortable working with or through, there's a little voice in the back of their heads that goes something like, Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you sure that answer choice is C? And if I give into that voice, I'm gonna double check this, or triple check this, or quadruple check this, and you just don't have time for that. So a lot of performing well on that ACT is just building your confidence that you can get a question like this, circle answer choice C, and then just keep moving on, moving confidently through the test. Which then brings me to the essay. At this point in the test, most students are kind of feeling like this. It gets even worse when they read that SAT essay prompt. So what students are going to be asked to do is they're going to be given a 600 to 700 word argument, and they're not going to be asked whether or not they agree or disagree with the author's point of view, but rather what rhetorical devices did the author use, and was he or she successful in the use of those devices. So you can just imagine that there's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of students who have never been exposed to rhetorical analysis writing and just have no idea what to do with this essay prompt. And there's going to be thousands of essays that are like, yeah, I thought the author was convincing because before I read her argument, I wasn't convinced. And now I'm convinced. And then they're going to look at the clock and be like, oh my gosh, I have 48 more minutes. Like, what on earth am I going to write about for 48 minutes? But if students know this essay is coming, it's not that bad an essay. What they're looking for is things like the author's use of symbolic language, like simile and metaphor, the author's use of exaggeration, the author's appeal to emotion, the author's citing an authority. For the rhetoric majors in the room, you might recognize that as Aristotle's triangle of rhetoric, where it's terms like ethos and pathos. Students, if you know them, you can kind of show off a little bit and throw them in your essay. If you don't know them, don't worry. They're not actually looking for those terms. But again, this is back to not walking into this test cold. If you know this essay is coming, it's pretty formulaic. The ACT, a little bit more forgiving. It is an argumentative essay or persuasive essay. Students are generally asked their opinion around something current event-ish, like should GMO foods be banned, yes or no? And then they'll write an essay, yes, they should be banned, no, they should not be banned, and then students are given 3 different perspectives on that issue and asked to incorporate those perspectives throughout. And again, this is when I say colleges really aren't putting any weight on these essay scores, but there are colleges out there that require them. So again, just as a hedge, we recommend that students, when they register for these tests, they go ahead and they register for it with the essay. So when that redesigned SAT first came out, a lot of publicity around it was, oh, this is just ACT 2.0, right? It's the same format, same test as the ACT. And the reason for that, 4 answer choices now on that SAT instead of 5. Rights-only scoring, that means there's no guessing penalty. So students, if you have no idea what an SAT question is asking, just choose your favorite SAT letter. On the ACT, if you run out of time on a section, just choose your favorite ACT letter and bubble it all the way down. Those grammar portions of the test, that writing test is almost identical to that ACT English test. Both are more curriculum-based tests, less aptitude-based tests. Again, a little bit forced on the SAT, but that incorporation of science. And again, similar content, similar skills tested. But having gone through what we just went through, not the same test. So on the SAT, more challenging questions, deeper understanding, narrower focus of skills, especially on the math with that focus on algebra, and more time per question. Whereas ACT, more straightforward, instant recognition of those questions, broader scope of skills, again on the math, more math topics covered, and again, requires that constant rapid pace, a total sprint. So at this point, I always kind of get the question of, all right, Drew, thanks for all this very detailed information, it's helpful, but now what? The million-dollar question, which test? And there's tons of urban legend out there in terms of this type of learner is better with this test, this type of learner is better with this test. At the end of the day, really the best way to decide whether to go in SAT or an ACT direction is to try both. Keep in mind, 70 to 80% of students score equally well on both tests. So often, whether to focus on the SAT or ACT often comes down to a student's personal preference. We always think of it as, which test did you hate the least? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which one do you think plays to your strength? Which one do you think you're going to have an easier time raising that score on? And for the juniors, again, I know there's huge pressure out there for early and often testing. Just start earlier and earlier and earlier. You're in no way behind on this. You have a PSAT score. I'll encourage you, take advantage of our pre-proctored practice tests in our Newton office. Give us a call, try a practice ACT just so you can kind of get a feel for what the pace of that test feels like, and then you'll have a nice side-by-side comparison in terms of deciding whether to focus on that SAT or focus on that ACT. And here's just to give you an idea in terms of how those scores compare. An ACT score of 30, so that's your English, reading, math, and science score. It's just the average. They're on a 1 through 36 scale. They add them all up, divide by 4. They do round up, so a 29.5 becomes a 30. But an ACT score of a 30 is about the equivalent of a 1400 on the SAT, just to try to orient you. And this concordance table is in that college guide that you have to give you a comparison between the two tests. And then just real quickly on subject tests, they're on the way out. They're dying a very slow dying death, but they haven't been completely eliminated from the college admissions landscape. But it's really only the most competitive colleges that still want to see subject tests. So these are hour-long multiple choice tests. They're in various content areas, which we'll look at in the next slide. We're down now to 8 colleges that require subject tests, and you can probably guess what those 8 colleges are. For those colleges that require subject tests, they only require 2. They don't care which one you take or which ones you submit. And there's another 14 schools that recommend. And generally for our students, recommend means required. But again, if those scores aren't going to help your application, you're under no obligation to take them. And just to give you a feel for it, just real quickly, these are the different content areas in which subject tests are offered. Again, just hour-long multiple choice. Our general recommendation is your college counseling office here is fantastic. Consult them, work with them in terms of making a plan if you're going to need subject tests in terms of which ones to take. And then also, generally it's best practice, you want to take that subject test when that class is ending. And then just the other one last point on subject tests, those colleges that require subject tests will not take an AP test score in lieu of subject tests, which feels ridiculous. You've just come out of an AP Bio, you've just taken an AP Bio exam, like do I really need to sit for the subject test as well? Think of it as killing 2 birds with 1 stone. All that prep that you've done for that AP Bio test is, or that AP Bio exam is going to help on that subject test. So hopefully it's not an extra, not a huge amount of work to then prepare for that subject test. So just keep that in mind. Vast majority of students are not going to need subject tests. It's really just those most ultra competitive colleges that still have them. as part of their process. And then just real quickly, in terms of when to take them, Lenny's already covered this. Again, most students hit their best scores late spring of junior year, fall of senior year. You can see, especially for the juniors, as we head into the standardized testing season, you can see there's a February ACT, then a March SAT, then an April ACT, then a May SAT, and we've gone this far, a June SAT and a June ACT, and then senior year, rinse, lather, repeat in September, October, November, December. Please don't do that. No colleges want you to take this 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. Most students hit their best scores, as Lenny referred to, after taking it 2 or possibly 3 times. And again, that's where that recommendation comes from. Late spring of junior year, fall of senior year. It's when students have had the most schooling under their belt. It's when they're most prepared to take these tests. And we always try to think of it in terms of taking the pressure off of students. If you take it, as Lenny kind of referred to, if you take it in late spring of junior year, you know you still have the fall if you need it, so you're in a position of everything to win, nothing to lose, right? So just keep that in mind as you go into it. And then for the sophomores in the room, again, I'm going to do everything I can in my power to try to push back on early and often testing. Our recommendation is it's too early to start now. There's obviously exceptions to this, but for our sophomores, we generally recommend over the summer, if you want to kind of get started on this, try a practice SAT, try a practice ACT, get a feel for the test, get a baseline score. It can be helpful in terms of just starting to think about whether you're going to go in an SAT or an ACT, but it really is, it's too early to start thinking about actually taking the SAT or ACT now. And then just real quickly to wrap up here, almost all colleges honor what they call score choice. So what score choice means is that you're in charge or in control of your scores. So if you take an ACT, first time it didn't go so well, and then you take it again the second time and it went much better, you can just send that second ACT score. So you decide which scores that colleges see. There are schools out there that want to see all scores. It's a very short list. Here's some of them on that list. Not entirely clear why they want to see all scores. Partly, they're trying to get ahead of serial testing. Again, no one wants you to take these tests 6, 7, 8 times. So by saying that you have to send all scores, they're hopefully slowing down that roll a little bit. And the other reason why they want to see all scores is because they're in fact doing something called superscoring. And what colleges that superscore, what they're doing is if students send score reports from more than one test, what colleges are doing is they're cherry picking the highest subsection scores from different administrations of the test. So in this case, 650 on the math in May, 640 in October for a combined SAT score of 1290. And this is the score, in my day, this is the score that went in the student's folder. Even though they didn't get it in one sitting, according to the college, that's their SAT scores, 640, 650. And they're doing this for a couple reasons. One, again, they're trying to read these applications supportively. So obviously, if you hit a 640 or a 650, that's what you're capable of. So they want to recognize your potential in hitting that score. And the other reason, we all kind of loathe the US News and World Report rankings, but standardized testing, unfortunately, is still a part of those rankings. So it's in the college's best interest to be able to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can. And superscoring is one way in which they're able to do that. Other things like, it sounds kind of crazy when you say it out loud, but a college's like bond rating can sometimes depend on the SAT and ACT scores that they publish. So again, it's a technique or it's a policy by which schools can report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can. Almost all colleges superscore the SAT. Less colleges superscore the ACT, but that's changing. More and more colleges are now superscoring the ACT, so they'll take a student's highest reading, math, science, and English test score from different administrations, and again, recalculate that composite score based on those highest subsection scores. And again, colleges aren't playing gotcha here. They're very upfront about what their scoring policies are, so you can always just call and ask, do you superscore, do you honor the score choice? And then the one thing just while I'm on this superscoring slide, so again, in terms of keeping those PSAT scores in perspective, the immediate thing, everyone's reaction is they start thinking about schools that they want to apply to. They look at those published SAT scores, they look at their PSAT scores, and they suddenly are like, oh my gosh, like these scores are so much lower than what those schools are publishing. Keep in mind Those scores that those colleges are publishing, they're seniors. They've taken the test 2 or 3 times, and in almost all cases, those scores have been super scored. And you're taking that score and you're comparing it to a PSAT score or a PSAT test that you just took once and you took early in October of junior year. So again, don't get hung up on that PSAT score. Don't panic if that score comes in a little bit lower than what you were hoping it would come in at. And then just real quickly in terms of just best practices around test prep, preparing for these tests is like anything. As you're hitting your peak performance in practice is when we want you to go in and try that test. So we always want, if you're going to do some prep or some self-study, we want that self-study leading up to that test date. And then in terms of the prep, 3 major areas go into it. One is content, just knowing what's on the test, so knowing all the math that's on it, knowing all the grammar rules that's on it. The other is strategy, just having a game plan for every section and for every question you're going to see. And then the best form of practice is practice, practice, practice on official practice tests. So through Khan Academy and through the College Board website, there's now 8 official SATs that have been released. You can download them for free and score them for free. There's another 2 PSAT tests that have been released, so a total of 10. And then on the ACT side, I think it's the official guide to the ACT. There's 3 ACT tests in there. You can find another like 7, 8, or 9 online. Again, you can download the test for free. They have the right answers in the scoring chart for them, so you can measure performance on it. Again, the benefit of that practice test, just feeling confident, knowing what's on it, identifying areas of strengths and weaknesses, and then most importantly, understanding when you miss questions, why that wrong answer is wrong, why that right answer is right, and most importantly, why did you choose that wrong answer? What led you to that wrong answer? That's how you're going to be able to improve your score, not just brute force practice test after practice test after practice test. And then we've covered this, but just in terms of summing up, as you're thinking about that testing plan, here's some guiding principles that we use as we're working with families to kind of guide them through this. Most students are going to score the same regardless of whether they go SAT or ACT. Again, 70 to 80% of students score equally well on both, but there is a population, about 20 to 25% who have a scoring preference for one or the other. And oftentimes, even if students score the same on both tests, just gut instinct, they have a leaning towards one test or the other. So it's a little bit of work up front, but it is worth the investment to try to find out if there's a test that you prefer over the other one. The other one is prepping for one will help with the other. So there is a lot of overlap in the content on these tests. So if you end up going down an SAT path and for whatever reason, it's just you're not getting the scores you were hoping for, you feel like you're plateauing and you want to try the ACT, if you've done some work on that SAT, it's going to help on that ACT. It's not like you're starting back at square one on that. And then again, I know you've heard me say it like 4 or 5 times, but students hit their best scores late spring of junior year, fall of senior year, because performance on these tests correlates with age, maturity, and time spent in school. And then I just leave you with this. At the end of the day, the most important thing that colleges are looking at is your day in and day out performance. How well are you doing in school? Are you taking advantage of the opportunities presented to you here at Brookline High? So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize academics over any kind of test prep. It doesn't do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of mental health, sleep, and most importantly, your day in and day out performance in school and your grades in school. So we're trying to strike that balance there. And I know it's easy for me to say up here, but really at the end of the day, it is just a test. Especially for the families going through this for the first time, try to have some fun with this if you can. Think of this as being the ultimate family bonding experience. When else are you going to be able to have everyone in the car? If you have younger siblings, they have to come too. Go on a 14-hour road trip. At some point, you're going to lose cell phone service, and you get to talk to one another, which is always exciting. And most importantly, and you'll hear this throughout as you get more into this process, at the end of the day, all these hoops and everything that's going to be asked of you during this college admission process, it's really all about just finding that school that's going to be the best fit. Where are you going to thrive academically? Where are you going to thrive socially? Where are you going to thrive extracurricularly? And it's really not just about trying to get into the most competitive school that you possibly can get into. It's really all about just you as a family coming together, figuring out what's important to you, and then creating that list based on those values or based on what's important to you. And then just real quickly about us. So we're based in Newton. Again, I've already mentioned the proctored practice test. No obligation there, totally free. Please take advantage of them. And then we do offer one-on-one in-home tutoring for families. So if you feel like you want a little bit of support on this, feel free to reach out. And even if you just want to call us, just to kind of help guide you through the testing plan a little bit. And again, I can't stress this enough, the college counseling office here is fantastic. Please reach out to them as well in terms of forming that testing plan and as you start building that list. All right.